want my vitamin drops and I want 'em now.
My name is Tom Mulholland, and I'm the fourth generation owner of Mulholland Grocery in Malvern, Iowa. Back in the 1870s, my grandfather opened the Mulholland Company.
Where's your magnifying glass?
We should be wearing our white gloves anyway.
This is another cool one. Look at that. Oh, this is a good one. Look at this. Look at the cars.
I guess I want to start at the beginning of your journey, and what were the foundations of your development as a storyteller?
Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, 2001. I think I've always loved films, and I always, when I was younger, wanted to go into acting. And I would always watch films critically, even from a really young age, even if technically I wasn't really sure what was going on or how a film was crafted. I was always looking at like an actor's performance and behavior. It's so weird, right? Like for a kid who has no knowledge of film, didn't come from a film family, first generation immigrant, Iranian American immigrant. And my family, we just loved movies. But I think for me, I knew I wanted to somehow go into entertainment. For me, I loved acting, and part of it was I was sort of following in the footsteps of my older sister who did theater and was getting into acting. And it wasn't until high school that I was like, okay, I want to now consider on-camera acting. And so like, how can I start to lay the groundwork for that? And one of the first ideas I had, which was very easily accessible when you're 16 years old, was to take a film and video class, TV film and video class in my high school as like an elective. And I did that. And it just totally like opened my world up in so many ways. I was like, oh wow, there's this position that's called being a director, and it's so cool because like you're not just acting or like performing someone else's words or someone else's vision. You actually have control over all of these elements. There's like music, and you can be in charge of shaping that. And editing and writing, and there's just like all these concepts that I started to think about and was like, this is so cool. And I think around that time I had seen Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, and I was blown away when I looked at the end credits list because it just was like an entire city of people. And for me, it was, I felt so, first of all, I definitely identified with the hobbits and the Shire. I felt like that was home.
I still think that's home.
Yeah, it's just beautiful. And for me, I was just so amazed at how a film could transport you to a completely different world, a world that doesn't exist, but felt so real, so honest. When you're in that world, you're fully immersed and you believe everything, and so invested in the characters, and saw myself in Frodo Baggins. But for me, it was kind of that experience, and then also like being Iranian American, growing up, and kind of like searching for that identity. Am I Iranian? Am I American? Like, where do I fit into this world? What's my voice? And then also just discovering that storytelling is like so much more than acting. Yeah, and I was really fortunate. When I graduated high school, there's this film program that worked with my high school, and I started, in my county, and I started working with them. By 18, I was teaching high school students directing. Don't know how I got that gig, but it taught me a lot about directing, actually. And I just started making my own films. My short films, started doing film festivals, went to USC Film School, and kind of was like, I want to be a director. And everything I did was strategic. I didn't go to college to go have fun. I was like 21, but very strategic about, okay, I'm going to make these films, and these films are going to be put in film festivals, and I'm going to learn about the business of film before I graduate from college. I'm going to have some portfolio pieces. So I think I've just always been a storyteller. I've always just been attracted to that, and, taken the steps and been fortunate to have wonderful mentors along the way.
When you think about storytelling, what are some of the critical pieces that you're looking for as you develop a film?
Critical pieces that I'm looking for. Oh, that's a wonderful question. I think a lot of time, well, there's a lot of different, pieces to it. Number one, your gut. What does your gut say? And your gut is just like the intelligence that is intangible, right? The added layer of intelligence, all these things that you're analyzing that you don't even, you can't even comprehend. So yeah, it's really leaning into my gut. And then I think, am I excited about this world? Is this a world that, to me, I feel piques my interest? Am I curious about it? And then, is this saying something new? And I think this is something that I'm up against a lot in the advertising space as well. It's always, I get briefs all the time, pass, 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 and for me, I'm always just saying, like, okay, this is the cultural conversation we're having right now, but how can we be a step ahead of it? Are we saying something new, or are we talking about an issue, but looking at it from a different angle, from a different perspective? That to me is the most interesting, because when I watch something, I think a lot of times, if we're so inundated with content. There's so much out there now. There's more distribution platforms than ever. There's so many different formats for storytelling, that are available to us. In some ways, it's wonderful, but in some ways, there's just so much. It's too much. It's dizzying, right? So I think when I watch something, I want to feel like, wow, that felt so original to me. And original doesn't always have to mean something like totally high concept and bizarre. Original can mean, cultural conversation that we are actively having, but just, from a different angle or a different perspective. Or, visually something that's elevated, or, just something that's interesting. So for me, I'm just always looking at, like, okay, does this world, this story, this issue, this topic, these characters, do they lend themselves to this type of storytelling? Sorry for the super long-winded answer.
I love it.
It's just so many different things that I'm like analyzing.
No, it's so important to a well-crafted story. There's so many pieces and moving parts that you have to be considering in order to be, moving the needle, but also moving people as you're building this. When you came out of film school, were you making more narrative work, or were you already in the documentary space at that time?
So when I came out of film school, I was like, I had made a couple narrative short films, and I was fully like on track to, jump in and make my narrative feature, or, become like a narrative director. And I made my first documentary just because it was an opportunity that fell in my lap. It was a film called Period, End of Sentence. And I had no idea what I was doing. I never anticipated making documentaries. I mean, I'd never even thought about it. And I also think it was sort of a timing thing, because I'd never really thought about documentary as a career path, because documentaries weren't like that big. Even when I was in film school, when I graduated film school in 2016, at that point, it was sort of the tipping point for documentaries. This is when documentaries started, like, showing up on streaming platforms and becoming more accessible to people all over the country, not just people who are actually seeking them out. So for me, it was like a timing thing. I'm like, okay, I guess I'm going to make this documentary. And somehow, it was a perfect storm situation, and the film did really well. It was acquired by Netflix, won an Academy Award. And so all of a sudden, it opened my world up to documentary films. And I loved it. I embraced it. I sort of embraced it. I'm still sort of a little bit of a rebel when it comes to the doc space. I think I'm a little bit of a rebel too when it comes to the advertising industry. But I think I kind of like that. I've always been in all of these different spaces. Like I am in the narrative space. I'm definitely like building that track of my career and developing myself in that sense. I'm continuing to make documentaries, continuing to try to like push the envelope when it comes to the form of documentary filmmaking, and advertising as well. But it's funny, I always feel like an outsider in all of these different spaces. And for a long time, I sort of felt this like imposter syndrome, right? Like being an outsider, like I don't belong here. What am I doing here making a commercial, or what am I doing here making this documentary? And I think like, as I started growing up, I was like, oh, you know what? Lean into that, embrace it. It's actually wonderful that you're an outsider. That's your voice. That's your perspective. You offer a completely different perspective. And it's done me well.
What was it about making period of an end of sentence that really stuck with you?
A lot of things. I mean, it taught me everything that I needed to know about like the business of film, right? The life after a film. Because I think that's something that like you don't learn when you're in film school. No one teaches you that. I learned about like distribution, and I learned about obviously like the Academy Awards and the politics that goes behind that, and how you run an Oscars campaign. I also was absolutely taken aback at how much of an impact the film had. I just thought like, oh, short film, how much of an impact can it have? It was sort of a little bit of the Frodo Baggins effect, right? I think it's like, what's the quote? It's like, I'm going to butcher this, but even the smallest creatures can change the course of the world, right? Yeah. And I think there's a lot of power in short films, in the short form. There is a lot of power. And I was just astonished. I was like, wow. I felt like it sort of, it came out, and it was a tipping point for documentaries. It was a tipping point for this cultural conversation we were having around periods, and just the patriarchy, and feminine hygiene, and so many different layers to this that sort of naturally existed within the film, that also were sort of tipping points in our culture. And so for me, it was like, wow, I could do this. I could go out and make doc films, and actually have an impact, or make an impact.
At what point did you then start stepping into the brand space with the documentary work?
It was a tricky period for me to navigate. I was 25 years old after, when the Oscars happened. It was my first doc. I hadn't made any other films. Completely underdeveloped as a filmmaker, as a storyteller. So much talent, so much potential, but like just not developed, And so for me, it was like a critical period of like, where do I go? Where do I go now? What direction do I go in? And I think I was really overwhelmed. I didn't know which I was being pulled in a lot of different directions, and had a lot of opportunities that I didn't feel I was ready for, or didn't even feel like I really wanted to entertain that badly. And honestly, my saving grace was like getting into advertising, because I had the opportunity to work in spaces where I could collaborate. I felt supported. I also felt like financially supported. I could make a living doing it, but also like I was working with budgets that were healthy. I wasn't like spending 2 years, running a Kickstarter campaign trying to get like $30,000 to go out and make my little passion project. Like I was able to explore and experiment and make these like branded films. And it just taught me a lot. It taught me a lot about the world. And when I entered the world, I was like, this is actually really exciting. And also I think when I entered the sort of advertising space, I think it was also at a time when, ads are really changing. The way that you speak to your audience is really changing now too, right? And a lot of that has to do with like I said, the different formats, right? And the different distribution platforms that are now available. It's like there's so many different ways that you could deliver a message to an audience. And there's so much experimentation happening, and so many resources available. And so for me, that I love that. I love the like unknown, and I love having the ability to like try things out. And also do that in a way that for me feels fulfilling, and that I have an opportunity to develop my creative voice.
As someone who felt like an outsider, especially in the ad world, and as you develop yourself as a documentary filmmaker, how do you approach brand storytelling? What are you trying to bring to those conversations?
I think I was like, think of myself as a consumer first. I'm always asking myself, like the North Star for me, whether it's me, pitching on a branded project, or even accepting if I'm going to engage on a branded project, or if I'm editing a film. I'm always asking myself, do I believe this? As a consumer, do I believe what I'm watching? And this happens a lot in documentary too. You could shoot a 5-hour interview with someone and you cut it down to 20 minutes, and you could be saying something totally different about a person in those 20 minutes. You could see a totally different side to them, right? So through that editing process, I'm always asking myself, do I believe this person? Whatever it is they're saying, do I believe them? And for me, can you ask, what was the question again? I just lost my train of thought.
How do you approach the brand space? Like,
Yeah.
from your perspective as, someone who's developed as a filmmaker, both narrative and documentary, when a brand comes to you, how do you engage in that dialogue?
Right. This is what I was saying. First question I ask myself when I look at the brief is like, do I believe this? Because a lot of times too, like brands are making documentaries and they're aligning with a certain message, has to like speak to the ethos of the brand and whatnot. And for me, I'm asking myself like, okay, well, does this feel honest, or does it feel like they're like pigeonholing a message into whatever their brand identity is just to be current? Because that happens all the time, right? And so I've gone really good at sort of like sussing that out from the get-go. And a lot of that starts with the initial conversation too, right? It's like you go in totally blind and you just want to have a conversation with the people who are driving this project, the people from the brand side. And you just want to get a sense for like, where is this coming from? Is this like something that the brand has been living and breathing? Is it something that they're pivoting to? Like, what's the intention behind all of this? And if to me it feels honest, and also it feels like I don't have to be in a position where I have to manipulate the storytelling as a filmmaker, I can actually just show up, feel confident that the brand, knows what direction they're headed in as far as their identity goes. I can show up and I can just do my job and have so much fun doing it and create, fantastic work. So that's really important to me, those like initial conversations, the initial reaction I have when I take a look at a brief. And then the next step is, okay, I feel like we're aligned here. It's also important for me now to like establish a certain dynamic, right? Because for me, it's really important, like as a creator, as a not just a director, but as a creator to like, to gain the trust of the brand, make sure that like, we don't have any doubts, we don't have any insecurities around what we're making here. We're all on the same page. We know what the vision is. We trust what the vision is. And then within that, there's so much trust that there's also room to play, because I'm also making a documentary here. So I want to leave room for spontaneity and, golden spontaneous moments to arise. So it's a lot. It's that dance, doing that dance and, making sure that everyone feels like good and secure throughout the process.
When you approach these kinds of projects, how much control do you give the brand in terms of how you're building out a narrative for them?
I mean, I think it varies, I think part of it is like figuring that out from the get-go. In the back and forth early conversations, you start to realize like what's really important for the brand. What are those like little tension points, those points that like I can feel they're nervous about and they really want me to address or find a solution for. And if I feel like I can find a solution for those things without betraying myself as a storyteller, and without betraying my own integrity as a storyteller, then I feel totally fine sort of, giving them that piece of control, right? Giving them the control over there. Because at the end of the day, like I'm commissioned to do this for the brand. I understand that. It's not a my way or a highway thing. It's a collaboration. But I think within that collaboration, there has to be, in order for everyone to be happy, in order for us to do our best work, boundaries.
How do you find setting those boundaries? Because the thing I find really exciting in the brand space is that brands have, where when you're making entertainment, you're making entertainment for as many people as you can get to watch that. Brands have their own audiences that are already in sort of pretty specific niches. When you get a brief, like I know you had mentioned, like you look at, do you believe it? But what are some of the things that you're inspired by and that you're excited to be working on?
Well, I'm also sort of, one of the questions I'm asking early on is like, what's the demographic here? Who are we selling this to? I have to understand that, because I have to like step into their shoes. As a consumer, I have to step into their shoes and then ask myself, do I believe them? Do I believe what I'm watching as a 16-year-old girl who grew up in Kansas? You know what I mean? So you're like role playing in a sense. What was your question again? Sorry, I'm so spacey. Good thing I'm not running this interview.
Just how do you approach the brief? How do you dive into it, and what are the important pieces that you want to see as a director to be able to go like, I'm in, let's make this together?
Yeah. First and foremost, it's, again, do I buy what I'm reading? And then, briefs come to you in several different stages. Sometimes it's a super open brief and the brand has no idea, what the film is that they want to make, but they know what the messaging is. That's always exciting to me, because then I have an opportunity to like really put on my writer brain, or my storytelling cap and dig and research and discover something. And those projects, usually I have more of an opportunity to like put myself into them, as opposed to briefs that come to me already like fully fleshed out. But sometimes briefs come to me pretty fleshed out, like they've already found the subject, they already know what the story is. And so what I'm asking myself is like, is this a film that I want to watch? Taking my vision out of it. If I'm just looking at the bones, if I'm just looking at the like plot points, or this character, are they some, is it someone that I think can carry a film? And is this a story that I think is interesting or saying something new, or a different angle or perspective, like I mentioned before? So, I feel like it needs to have those elements. And then if it does have those elements, then I am usually very excited to meet the person. I think working with brands sometimes and agencies, it's sort of like there's a tension between documentary and brand. There is a tension, a conflict a lot of times, because this idea of documentary is discovering, right? It's a process of like research and not always having like a super tight plan, allowing yourself to the room to just go out and shoot and uncover something. But then when it comes to brands, right, or branded content, it's like it gets a lot more prescriptive, right? A lot of times brands get nervous if you can't provide them with like an outline or, every single story beat or pictures of all the cast. And, they want to know what the plan is because they have to like sell it through on their end. So there is that tension. And I think for me, one of the like most critical points throughout this pitching process is marrying those two things together, right? Like, how can I find that middle ground so that my voice can come through? I'm thinking of creative ideas, a vision for this film that can set it apart in some way. But also, I'm doing my job as a director who's been hired, who's, commissioned to make this for a brand, and making sure that I'm like answering to their needs, doing it again in a way that feels true to me.
It's funny the way you describe that, because like sometimes when I tell people like, hey, I'm a director that makes brand-funded documentaries, and they go like, well, can a brand-funded thing be a documentary?
Yeah.
And like when you look at that work and some of the stories you tell, like what advice would you give brand leaders looking at navigating this space?
Trust your filmmakers. It's like it all boils down to trust. You know, I've been in situations where I've done branded films and I could feel there wasn't trust there. And it didn't have anything to do with me and my vision. It had everything to do with however their inner workings were. People were not trusting each other. You know, the hierarchy was, everything was off. But the most productive and, you know, successful projects that I've done it's always started with trust. Trust from the brand. The brand is willing to go there and take risks. You know, they're in a challenging moment, because we're always going to reach moments, you know, where we're at a fork in the road and we have to make a difficult decision. They look to the filmmaker to you know, guide them through that decision. I'm not saying make the decision, but guide them, right? Strong recommendation. I love saying it's my strong recommendation. Yeah, I mean, I think that's super important.
As a director, what do you look at as your responsibility to the brand as someone that's guiding this story for them?
You know, I'm always editing in my head as a documentary filmmaker. You know, whether I'm doing interviews or I'm thinking of like a scene, or I'm in the middle of shooting a verite scene and a character says something that's amazing, I'm thinking about how that fits into the edit, not just how it's amazing as a standalone line, right? I'm doing that at the same time with the brand's messaging. I'm always keeping that, you know, in the back of my mind. I'm never letting that go. So I think like there's a process for me where I'm constantly sort of funneling this narrative through these different lenses, you know, or through these different filters, right? And there's always the brand filter, you know. If I think of an amazing creative idea, I can't just be in love with it and say like, we're going to run with it. I have to run it through my brand filter. You know, what is it saying about the brand? How is it answering, you know, whatever it is their prompt is, whatever it is their needs are. And if it's not, then maybe it's not something that we include, or maybe I need to approach it differently. You know, maybe I don't discard the idea at all. I need to like find a way to sell it through, you know, because I think there's always this period where you have to like sell things through, and you need to be convinced, you know, you need to put on your brand cap, right? And say, yes, I can see how this actually is in service of the brand. That's my job. I have to do both, you know, and there's a tension there, but I love being in the middle of that tension, you know. It's great. That's where the exciting work happens.
When you look at this space and you look at even just how it's evolved, like in the last 5 years, and how brands are sort of, it seems like more brands are willing to take on more risk to tell different stories. What are you excited about when you look at the next 3 to 5 years?
Oh, I'm so excited about this idea of like brand funded films. And I like to say brand funded films instead of like the traditional like branded content, because it's not content. Like I think we're at a place where we're realizing that like content is content, right? And I think a lot of that has to do with like TikTok and, you know, social media and stuff. Like content is content. But then there are films that filmmakers are making, right? Storytellers are making. And for me, what's really exciting is like brands are getting behind those projects, and they're building relationships with the Netflixes and the Hulus, the streaming platforms, right? The distribution platforms. And they're looking to a new form of advertising, right? And for me, that's exciting because I have an opportunity to actually go off and be a filmmaker, make a documentary series, or make a narrative feature film that is funded by a brand, but I don't have to worry about the brand. You know, there's you know, they're big leap of faith, you know. for a brand to take. And I find that more brands are doing that, and I love it. And those are the brands I want to work with. I mean, there's plenty of brands that are not willing to go there yet, and those are just not for me, not the brands I'd be working with. Yeah. And I want to add too, to one of your earlier questions, you say like, what's like in my criteria too when I get a brief, like what's something that I feel like, oh, there's a great opportunity here to make a great film. Another thing that's really telling is sometimes I'll get a brief and they'll be like, oh, post-production, a month or 2 weeks. And one of the issues that I have is, okay, we can't be making a documentary film on a commercial timeline in the edit, because documentaries are made in the edit. And you have to allow time for yourself to like discover things in the edit. You know, a lot of times it's like you have a good sense of what your film is going into the edit, turns into something quite different, right? And the film is only as strong as the edit is, and so you really need to allow yourself time to do the cuts, have the back and forth, you know, and also like just the music and the sound design and the sound mix and the graphics and like all of these things, you know. I'm not interested in working on those projects that are like, okay, great, we're going to shoot it and we're going to cut it in, you know, a few weeks. So for me, actually, you know, I've been fortunate. The projects that I've engaged in have all had like pretty healthy post-production timelines. And that's one of the first conversations I have with the client is, you know, can we stretch this timeline a bit? Do we have ample time to like actually make the film that we want to make?
I love it. I remember I was in a conversation with the director, and one of the pieces he told me was a documentary is not a real documentary if you already know the ending before you shoot. And it's that same idea, right? Which is like, you go in with an idea, but this thing will organically evolve as you get into it. Like in my experience, like I've never had an interview go the same way in the pre-interview as it goes on camera. Because by then you've normally built a deeper relationship and you actually get a way better story than what you thought you were going into. But because of that, you now have to go back to the brand and go like, hey, you remember the thing we talked about? It's actually way better now, but it's very different than what we talked about.
Yeah. And a lot of times what happens is like you'll have, you know, I'm very careful too about what I'm promising when I'm going into these projects. You know, I used to overpromise because I was young and I didn't know better. But now I'm careful about what I'm promising because I always want to leave room for exploration, and I always want to give myself the sort of cushion to say, you know, I know we wanted to head in this direction, but that's not the energy I received, and I'm not about to go manufacture that. You know, I don't want to manufacture that. I'm not talking about like, oh, create some elevated cool shots. I mean, I do that. I love doing that. I'm just talking about like, I'm talking about like story beats, right? You know, for me, it's also a process with your subject too. It's like, what's their energy, you know, when you're meeting them? What are they willing to give you? Are they willing to go there with you? You know, maybe if not today, maybe in 3 days, but I have to work them, you know, I have to work on that and I have to meet them where they are. So it's a lot, it's just such a dance. It's a constant dance. And I think it's really important to have like a, you know, like a high level sort of outline of the direction that you're hoping to, you know, head toward. Just also so the brand can feel like confident and like they're clued in and they know what you're thinking. But within that, I mean, anything could happen.
Yeah. Well, and that's where that partnership and that trust is really important in sort of relieving a bit of that tension.
Yeah, that trust is super important because the reality is we all need to accept that things are not going to go the way that we anticipated. So do you trust me enough in the moment when I'm off on my own with my cinematographer that I'm going to keep the brand's, you know, ethos in mind?
Yeah. Amazing. Before I let you go, I have 5 not so rapid fire questions. First, what is a story that had a big impact on your life? And I sort of already know it's the Fellowship of the Ring, but what's a story that had a big impact on your life and why?
Okay, yes, Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring. Ironically, it's not a film I would ever make. And a film that I would make that I discovered when I was, I think, 18 years old was A Separation by Iranian director Asghar Farhadi. He won the Academy Award in 2011, I believe, for Best Foreign Film. And he's won it twice, actually. Brilliant filmmaker, our pride and joy. But for me, it was really the first time that I saw an Iranian film in a theater in Southern California, you know, and I could go with my parents, and but a film that like had reached the international stage to the extent that it did. It spoke to me in so many different ways as a storyteller, my sensibilities, you know. It's sort of like, as a narrative film, he wrote the screenplay, I believe, but it felt like a documentary. It felt so true and it felt so honest. And I think, you know, I 100% latched onto that and said, like, these are the types of films I want to make. I want to live in this like hybrid space. And so when I make documentaries, I'm putting on my narrative hat, you know, and I'm thinking about how it can mirror fiction. And the same when I'm making a fiction film. I'm thinking about how it could, you know, mirror real life. How can we like make it feel like a documentary?
I love it. What is one film you think everyone should watch?
One film I think everyone should watch. A Separation.
Easy.
Yeah, A Separation.
What's something you never leave home without?
Lactate pills. I was gonna say my phone and keys and stuff, but like that's a given. Lactate pills. I'm severely lactose intolerant.
What's an important place for you to go to find inspiration?
I always find the most inspiration when I'm making a project. And I'm usually traveling. You know, I think I feel so fortunate as a documentary filmmaker. You travel a lot. You know, I was just in Cambodia for a TV project, and I was so inspired. We were shooting in this like floating fishing village, and it was the first time I'd ever seen one before. And we were out on a boat, and I was just thinking about like, you know, the way of life on these floating villages. And I was so inspired. I was like, gotta come back here, spend a month, live here, and make a documentary about this floating village. Yeah, it's always when I'm traveling and making other things.
Love it. And my last question is, what do you think is the most important skill for storytellers to develop?
Most important skill. Oh, there's just so many. I think it's just like conviction, you know, confidence, like just doing things with conviction, you know, like listening to your inner voice and not having any doubts about it, you know, just following it. And I think there's always going to be other opinions and tensions, and, you know, and you're always going to want to collaborate with people. But I think it's the confident creatives, the ones that, you know what it is that they want and why, you know, they can back it up with intention. I find that those are actually the people that make some of the best collaborators.
I love it.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks. Sorry for the long-winded rambling answers. I'm really sorry.
No, I love it.